Hi, I'm Evan Keeble from the Australian Institute of International Affairs National Office, and I'm here with Dr. Amy King. Amy is a senior lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, with particular expertise in Chinese foreign security policy and China-Japan relations. In 2016, she published her book, China-Japan Relations After World War II, Empire, Industry and War, 1949 to 1971. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
So, to start off with, what is your take on China's recent boycott of lot and Chinese tourism in South Korea due to the implementation of the THAAD missile system?
Yes, I mean, this is obviously an issue and a series of events that's garnered a huge amount of attention in recent weeks. And what I guess the first thing to say is it's helpful to be reminded of what China's security concerns are in this particular dispute. We focus a lot on the fears of Japan, of the United States and South Korea, obviously. But China has real concerns about the ability of the US radar system to potentially look into China's own territory and to perhaps reduce China's nuclear deterrent capability. So this helps to perhaps explain why it's gone on the offensive, if you like, in using economic coercion of these South Korean companies. I guess, though, the question is, has China been effective? Has it been successful? And here I think the jury is out. Unfortunately, well, from China's perspective at least, unfortunately, South Korea has gone ahead with deployment of the THAAD missile system. And from the perspective of the wider world, I think we now have very much a perception of China as an unreliable economic partner, a country that's willing to punish its trade partners to get what it wants in the security or political realm. And ultimately it's been unable to achieve that security goal. So I guess a question now for China's leaders perhaps is, do they have other tactics? Are there other approaches they could take? And more generally, I think for those of us that are interested in this Korean Peninsula question, is to understand, what actually might be an effective way of resolving some of the underlying security concerns, not only of China, but also of the United States, of North and South Korea, and the other players as well.
Great. So, moving on from there, what is China's approach to regional institutions such as RCEP, the AIIB or ASEAN? Does China have a grand strategy towards these kinds of institutions?
So I guess for a long time, really sort of from the end of World War II up until the 1980s, early 1990s, China didn't participate in regional institutions for the most part. It really tended to be out on its own or supportive of third world countries and very, very hostile to the international system more generally because it perceived that system as hostile to China. Now, since the 1990s, we've seen China really ramp up its participation in organisations like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit and others. And it's become a lot more comfortable and confident in participating in these institutions. But I think for a long time, through the 90s into the early 2000s, China was a relatively passive actor in these institutions. And so what we've seen in the last few years is China stepping up its engagement much more actively and even putting forward new institutions like the AIIB when it feels that there is a gap perhaps in the particular interests it might have, in this case in infrastructure spending. And when it feels like the existing international institutions like the IMF or the World Bank are not responsive to the needs of emerging countries like China and are not creating more of a say or voice for these countries. So I think to the extent that China has a grand strategy, it's to do more, to be much more proactive, to try and shape the regional order that it wants, and that includes using these new institutions.
Great. Third and final question. In the future, if China does find itself in a position of preponderance in Asia or even in a position of power sharing with the US, how do you think China will treat Japan based on their historical ties?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really thorny question for anyone interested in the region. And it's a question I actually looked at directly in an article I wrote a couple of years ago. We know that China, since Xi Jinping came to power, has put forward this new model of major country relations or great power relations, 新兴大国关系. And that was very much about its dealings with the United States. I was interested in where Japan fit into that concept. And so I went away and looked at the hundreds of Chinese articles, both academic articles and newspaper articles and policy statements written about the concept to see what role Japan played, if any. And the answer was very little. There was very, very little thinking about Japan's role. And where the Chinese side did think about Japan's role, it was in a pretty I guess, unhelpful way, if you like, from Japan's perspective. So they saw Japan very much as a non-great power, a country that China had surpassed, not one of the major powers like the United States or China. They saw Japan as a country that didn't have a legitimate right to use military power because of its historical role in World War II and prior to that. They saw Japan as a country with whom China largely had territorial disputes with. And they also learned, I guess, from Japan's mistakes in the past. So they looked at the way that Japan had risen to power and the military role that Japan had played in the 1930s and 1940s, which China viewed very much as a disaster for the region and for itself. And they said, we won't play this role. So their thinking about the future is perhaps based on their past relationship with Japan. Now that makes things very, very difficult because if the Chinese government continues to view its relationship with Japan through the past, it will continue to deny Japan any kind of legitimate, more active or activist security role in the region. And we've already seen the Chinese government very, very critical of steps taken by Japan over the last decade or so in that direction. And we've also seen, I think, China not only concerned about Japan's kind of historical revisionism, but also Japan's desire to kind of get out from under the post-World War II order that was created to change kind of the perception of Japan in the region. And this is something that the Chinese government has very consistently over the last decade or so been critical of. So I guess coming back to your question, China doesn't have a view of its relationship with the United States that would give Japan a more equal role or view Japan as a legitimate great power. It views Japan very much as a country marred by its history and a country that perhaps because of that past could have the ability to constrain China's rise again.
Mm. Well, Amy, thanks very much for joining us. Very informative, very interesting. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Thanks.